Imagine falling asleep in your own home, only to wake up to the sound of wood splintering, a shadow standing over your bed, and the cold steel of your own axe being raised against you. This was not a nightmare for the people of New Orleans in 1918. It was reality. A faceless killer walked their streets, breaking into homes at night, leaving families butchered, and disappearing without a trace. He became known as the Axeman of New Orleans. The year was 1918, and New Orleans was already a city of contradictions. By day, its streets pulsed with life. Shopkeepers shouting prices at stalls, children chasing each other between horse-drawn carts, the smell of seafood and spices drifting from the French market. But when the sun went down, the city changed. Gas lamps cast weak pools of light, leaving long alleys in near darkness. The laughter from jazz clubs mixed with the clatter of streetcars, and beyond that, silence. Families locked up their shops and retreated to the rooms behind them. These weren't mansions with guards or fences. They were simple homes, fragile sanctuaries separated from the street by nothing more than thin wooden doors. Grocers, most of them Italian immigrants, kept their livelihoods and loved ones under the same roof. They believed their close-knit neighborhoods, where everyone knew each other's name, kept them safe. But safety was only an illusion. In those same quiet hours, someone else walked the streets. Someone who knew that doors could be pried open, that an axe left by the stove could become a weapon, that sleeping families made the easiest prey. New Orleans was famous for its music, but beneath the rhythm of trumpets and pianos, another sound was coming. The thud of footsteps in the night, the crack of splintering wood, and the final, terrible silence after screams were cut short. The city was alive, yes, but it was also vulnerable. And in 1918, it was about to learn that monsters didn't always hide in the swamps or in stories told to frighten children. Sometimes they lived right outside your door. On the morning of May 23rd, 1918, neighbors on Upper Street were jolted awake by screams tearing through the dawn. They rushed toward the small apartment above a grocery store owned by Joseph and Catherine Maggio. What they found inside would mark the beginning of a nightmare. The bedroom was drenched in blood. Catherine lay lifeless, her throat cut so deeply it nearly severed her head. Beside her, Joseph clung to life, his skull fractured by repeated axe blows. He would die minutes later, unable to explain what had happened. The police arrived quickly, led by Chief of Detectives Arthur Opry. Officers examined the grisly scene with the tools available in 1918: eyes, hands, and instinct. On the floor, they discovered a straight razor smeared with blood. Propped against the wall was the Maggio's own axe, its handle slick with gore. There was no sign of robbery. Jewelry and cash were untouched. The back door told the real story. A wooden panel had been carefully removed, not smashed, but pried open with precision. Whoever entered the Maggio home had taken his time, slipping inside like a phantom. Detectives searched for fingerprints, a science still in its infancy. They found nothing usable. The killer had left no muddy boots, no dropped items, not even a smudge. It was as if he had walked through without leaving a trace. Adding to the mystery, the razor was traced back to Andrew Maggio, Joseph's brother. He admitted he had owned it, but claimed it had been stolen days before. Suspicion fell on him briefly, but there was no evidence. The wounds on Catherine and Joseph were far too frenzied, too calculated, for a panicked family quarrel. The Maggio's murders were unlike anything New Orleans had seen before. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong, nor a jealous rage. It was something colder. The precision of the entry, the choice of weapon, the silence of the night. They pointed to a predator who killed not for money, but for something far darker. And though investigators tried, they left the house that morning with no answers. Only a city's first taste of fear and the chilling realization that the killer was still out there. The Maggio murders might have been written off as an isolated act of violence, if the bloodshed had stopped there. But in June of 1918, another attack struck New Orleans, and this time, the city began to see a pattern forming. The victims were Louis Bissumer, a grocer, and his mistress Harriet Lowe. Early in the morning, a deliverman arrived at their store and heard faint groans. Forcing his way inside, he found the couple sprawled across the floor of their bedroom, both with massive head injuries. The weapon? Once again, an axe belonging to the victims themselves. The police swarmed the scene, searching for clues. They noticed that the attacker had once again gained entry by tampering with a panel on the back door. But unlike the Maggio case, both victims were still alive when discovered. This gave detectives hope of a breakthrough. Harriet Lowe, despite her shattered skull, was able to speak briefly from her hospital bed. She insisted that Besummer was the attacker, accusing him of being a German spy who had tried to kill her. Detectives were eager for answers, and in the paranoia of World War I, her story seemed believable. Besummer was arrested, but investigators soon realized Harriet's testimony was incoherent and inconsistent. Days later, she died from her wounds. Forensics provided little clarity. The axe had been wiped down. Bloodstains showed the couple had been struck while lying in bed, but beyond that, the scene yielded nothing useful. The lack of footprints or fingerprints was becoming a trademark. That same summer, another victim appeared, Anna Schneider, an 8 months pregnant woman who was attacked in her sleep. Her scalp was torn open by a series of blows, yet she survived. When questioned, Anna described nothing but a dark figure looming over her. With each case, detectives tried to connect dots. Italian grocers seemed to be a recurring target, though Schneider did not fit that pattern. The entry points, however, were identical. The attacker wasn't breaking doors violently. He was dismantling them, slipping inside with patience. It was as if the killer enjoyed the preparation almost as much as the kill. By late summer, the press was already whispering about a serial attacker. Families nailed boards across their doors, slept with weapons by their beds, and prayed that the shadow would pass them by. The police, however, were drowning in leads that led nowhere. Witnesses saw nothing. Neighbors heard nothing. The Axeman, though no one had yet given him that name, was creating an atmosphere where the silence of the night was more terrifying than any scream. March of 1919 changed everything. For months, the killer had been a shadow, known only by the devastation he left behind. But now he had found his voice. On March 13th, the Times-Picayune received a chilling letter. The writer claimed to be the very murderer haunting New Orleans. His words dripped with arrogance and menace. They have never caught me, and they never will. They cannot stop me, because I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit from hell. He signed the letter with a name that would forever cling to him, the Axeman. The message mocked the police, calling them fools, and declared himself unstoppable. But then, it offered something far stranger, a condition. On the night of Tuesday, March 19th, the city had a choice. Play jazz music in every home and every bar, or risk death. The demand was theatrical, bizarre, almost playful, and it sent the city into chaos. Detectives studied the letter, but forensics offered no leads. Handwriting analysis was crude, ink and paper couldn't be traced, and there was no way to prove or disprove its authenticity. Yet the timing, the tone, the smug confidence, it felt exactly like the hand of the killer they had been chasing. As the fateful night approached, fear spread like wildfire. Families who had never cared for jazz purchased phonographs or hired musicians. Dance halls were packed shoulder to shoulder. The sound of trumpets, clarinets, and pounding pianos filled the streets until the city itself seemed to pulse with music. Those who listened that night described something surreal, a citywide concert born out of terror. Even skeptics who had dismissed the letter found themselves humming along, unwilling to gamble with their lives. The police patrolled nervously, waiting for screams to break through the music. But none came. The Axeman kept his promise. Not a single murder took place that night. To some, the letter was proof of a maniac with a theatrical streak, relishing the power he held over a city. To others, it was evidence of something unearthly, a demon who craved not just blood, but attention. Either way, New Orleans had danced to the tune of a killer, and the silence that followed only deepened the question. Was the Axeman finished, or was he simply waiting for the music to die? For a brief moment after the night of jazz, New Orleans exhaled. Some believed the Axeman's letter had been a bluff. Others dared to hope the music had satisfied him, that he had moved on. But the silence was only the pause before the storm. In August of 1919, screams once again shattered the fragile calm. This time, the victims were Steve and Sarah Cormiglia, grocers in Gretna, just across the Mississippi River from New Orleans. Their neighbor, Rose Cortimiglia, heard cries in the early morning and rushed over. Inside, she discovered a nightmare. Steve was slumped on the floor, dead from axe blows, while Sarah was barely clinging to life, cradling her 2-year-old daughter, who had been struck and killed in the attack. The brutality shocked even seasoned detectives. The wounds were savage, the kind that spoke of rage or obsession rather than robbery. Once again, the weapon was the family's own axe. Entry had been made by chiseling out a panel on the back door, the same meticulous method seen before. This time, however, detectives thought they had a break. In her grief and confusion, Sarah Cortimiglia accused their neighbors, the Giordano family, of being responsible. Father and son were swiftly arrested, but their guilt never quite fit the facts. The forensic evidence, bloodstains, weapon angle, forced entry, all matched the Axeman's established pattern, not a neighborhood feud. Years later, Sarah herself recanted, admitting she had named them under pressure and shock. But by then, the damage had been done. The investigation dug deeper into the wounds. Doctors noted the consistency of the skull fractures across victims, the way the blows were delivered with force aimed at the head and neck. The signature was undeniable. Whoever wielded the axe had practiced control, even in his frenzy. Yet, medicine in 1919 could not determine more than blunt force trauma. The science to distinguish angle, handedness, or exact sequence of strikes simply didn't exist. Then came the Pepitone case, perhaps the Axeman's most infamous attack. In October 1919, Mike Pepitone's wife awoke to a horrifying scene. Her husband sprawled in their bed, blood spraying across the walls in violent arcs. The room looked less like a burglary and more like a slaughterhouse. Mrs. Pepitone described figures fleeing the scene, suggesting perhaps more than one attacker. But when detectives arrived, they found no evidence of accomplices, only the same eerie calling card, an axe left behind, and no trace of entry except a tampered panel. The forensic angle again betrayed the investigators. Blood covered nearly every surface, but DNA testing was decades away. No usable fingerprints were recovered. Neighbors had rushed into the house, trampling potential clues before police secured the crime scene. The case once again dissolved into smoke. With each attack, the Axeman's legend grew darker. He wasn't killing for money, nor even for silence. He was killing because he could, and because New Orleans could not stop him. The city lived in a cycle of horror, nights of quiet dread, followed by mornings of blood. And through it all, detectives faced the same maddening truth. They had patterns, they had corpses, they had theories, but they had no suspect who fit, and no signs capable of catching a killer who seemed to vanish into the ether. The violence was escalating, and so was the sense that the Axeman was untouchable. By the autumn of 1919, New Orleans was drowning in fear, but also in speculation. With the killer never caught at the scene, detectives and citizens alike turned to theories, some rational, some bizarre, and all born of desperation. The first and most common idea was that the Axeman targeted Italians, especially grocers. Many of the victims were Italian immigrants who ran small neighborhood shops. This led investigators to suspect connections to the Mafia, which was active in New Orleans at the time. Could the attacks have been revenge killings, disguised as random violence? It was possible. Yet, the inclusion of victims like Anna Schneider, a pregnant woman with no ties to the grocery trade, cast doubt on this theory. The pattern was there, but it wasn't perfect. Other detectives whispered about a lone madman, a drifter who roamed the streets and slipped away after each crime. In fact, police briefly pursued such a man, a petty criminal named Joseph Montfort, who had mob ties and a violent reputation. He was rumored to have extorted local grocers and later murdered the widow of Mike Pepitone in Los Angeles. But evidence tying him to the Axeman murders was circumstantial at best, and his name never held in court. The most unnerving idea was that there wasn't just one Axeman. Theories of copycat killers began to swirl. The murders stretched over nearly 2 years, with periods of silence between them. Was it possible that more than one person had taken up the axe, feeding the legend while confusing the investigation? This could explain why some survivors described different figures, from a tall man to multiple shadows. But again, detectives had no proof, only speculation. Forensics gave the police little to work with. The blows were consistent, yes, but they lacked the science to distinguish whether all the murders were committed by the same hand. Handwriting experts compare the Axeman's infamous letter to other samples, but results were inconclusive. Ink, paper, and razors left no forensic trail. Then came the whispers of the supernatural. Some citizens truly believe the Axeman's claim of being a spirit from hell. After all, how else could a man enter homes so quietly, kill so brutally, and escape without a trace? Spiritualists and fortune-tellers began to offer their services, claiming they could sense the killer's presence. The police publicly dismissed such talk, but privately, some detectives admitted that the killer's ability to vanish bordered on impossible. Through it all, the greatest enemy of the investigation was the crowd itself. Crime scenes were trampled by curious neighbors long before detectives arrived. Bloodied sheets were carried out, furniture moved, even weapons handled before police could secure them. Every scene was contaminated, every shred of evidence corrupted. Theories piled up, but none could stop the blood. And the more people talked, the larger the Axeman became. Not just a criminal, but a legend, a phantom who existed as much in rumor as in reality. And then, the killing simply stopped. After the murder of Mike Pepitone in October 1919, the Axeman seemed to vanish into thin air. No more door panels were pried open. No more families were found in blood-soaked bedrooms. For a city that had lived in terror for nearly 2 years, the silence was almost as unsettling as the violence. Detectives waited, convinced the axe would fall again. Weeks passed, then months. But no new cases matched the Axeman's signature. Some officers believed he had been arrested for another crime. Others thought he had left New Orleans entirely, slipping into another city, another life. Citizens speculated endlessly. Had the Axeman tired of his game? Had he died? Or had he simply been a phantom all along, vanishing back into the shadows he claimed to come from? Whatever the truth, New Orleans was left with wounds that never healed. The killer who had taunted the city, danced with its music, and painted its walls in blood had disappeared, undefeated, unidentified, and unforgettable. The Axeman vanished after 1919, leaving nothing but questions. No arrests, no confessions, no answers. If his crimes happened today, DNA and modern forensics might have unmasked him in days. But in 1919, he thrived in a world without science strong enough to catch him. That failure turned him into something more than a killer. He became a legend. To this day, no one knows if the Axeman was a mob hitman, a wandering madman, or something darker. What we do know is that he played with an entire city's fear, and then slipped into silence. The silence after Pepitone's murder is the loudest sound of all. It reminds us that some monsters are never caught, some mysteries are never solved, and some stories live forever because of the questions they leave behind. The Axeman didn't just kill his victims, he carved his legend into the bones of New Orleans. And more than 100 years later, the city still listens for footsteps in the dark, wondering if the music ever truly stopped.